The gunshot echoed across the rugged California landscape as Grace Evans ducked behind her porch, clutching her father's old shotgun with trembling hands. It was the autumn of 1873 in Calistoga, and the night that would forever change her life had just begun with the sound of distant hoofbeats growing closer to her isolated homestead. Grace had been alone on her small ranch for nearly 2 years since her father passed, maintaining the modest property through sheer determination and the skills he'd taught her. At 24, she'd grown accustomed to the solitude, preferring the company of her horses and the vast wilderness surrounding her home to the prying eyes and whispers of townsfolk. The approaching rider came into view as moonlight broke through the clouds, illuminating a man slumped precariously in his saddle. His horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion, seemed to know exactly where to go, heading straight for the warm glow of her cabin window. "Stay back," Grace called out, raising the shotgun as the horse drew nearer. "State your business or turn around." The rider made no response, and as the horse came to a halt before her porch steps, Grace could see why. Blood darkened his shirt, spreading across his side, and his face was pale beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. As she watched, he slipped sideways from the saddle, hitting the ground with a dull thud that made her wince for a moment. Grace stood frozen, weighing her options. The man could be anyone, an outlaw, a drifter, or someone running from the law. But she couldn't leave him to die in her yard, not when there was a chance she could help. Setting the shotgun aside but within reach, Grace cautiously approached. The stranger was breathing, though each breath seemed labored. In the moonlight, she could see he was handsome, strong-jawed, with dark hair that curled slightly at the edges of his collar. He couldn't have been more than 30. "Mister, can you hear me?" Grace knelt beside him, gently rolling him onto his back. The man's eyes fluttered open, revealing a startling blue even in the dim light. "Got shot," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Wasn't expecting company tonight." Despite the gravity of the situation, Grace felt the corner of her mouth twitch. "Neither was I," she replied, already assessing the wound. "Can you stand if I help you? Need to get you inside." The man nodded weakly, and with considerable effort, Grace helped him to his feet. He was tall and solid, making the journey to the cabin door a struggle as he leaned heavily against her smaller frame. By the time they crossed the threshold, they were both breathing hard. "Name's Garrett," he murmured as she guided him to her bed. "Garrett Keller." "Grace Evans," she replied, helping him sit on the edge of her bed. "Now hush and save your strength. That bullet needs to come out." As Garrett collapsed back onto her pillows, Grace moved quickly to gather what she needed: clean cloths, her father's whiskey, a sharp knife, and the medical kit she kept for emergencies. She'd treated injured animals and her own wounds over the years, but never a gunshot wound on a man. When she returned, Garrett's eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. Grace steeled herself and cut away his blood-soaked shirt, revealing a nasty wound just below his ribs. The bullet appeared to have entered his side, thankfully missing vital organs based on its position. "This will hurt," she warned as she uncorked the whiskey bottle. Garrett's eyes opened, a flicker of amusement crossing his pain-etched features. "Wouldn't be the first time," he said, then took the bottle she offered and drank deeply before handing it back. "Do what you need to do." Grace poured whiskey over the wound, causing Garrett to hiss and grip the bedsheets. She worked methodically, cleaning around the injury before taking the knife in hand. The bullet wasn't deep, but extracting it would be painful. "Hold on to something," she instructed, and to her surprise, Garrett reached for her free hand, squeezing it once before releasing it to grip the bedframe instead. The next minutes were intense as Grace concentrated on removing the bullet with as little additional damage as possible. Garrett remained remarkably stoic, only a few grunts escaping his clenched teeth as she worked. When the metal finally emerged from his flesh, both of them exhaled in relief. "Almost done," Grace assured him, quickly cleaning the wound again before preparing to stitch it closed. Her needle and thread moved with practiced precision, closing the ragged edges of the wound with neat stitches. By the time she finished, Garrett's face was ashen, sweat beading his forehead. Grace wiped his brow with a cool cloth, then bandaged his side with clean strips of fabric. "Thank you, love," he whispered, his voice hoarse from pain, eyes briefly meeting hers before closing as exhaustion claimed him. The words caught Grace off guard. They were simple, possibly meaningless, just the delirious gratitude of a wounded man. Yet something about the way he'd said it, or perhaps the unexpected intimacy of caring for a stranger's wounds in her own bed, left her flustered. She checked his pulse, relieved to find it steady. Rising from the bedside, Grace moved to tend to his horse, bringing the animal water and securing it in her small stable alongside her own mare. The night was growing colder, and as she returned to the cabin, she wondered what dawn would bring with this mysterious wounded cowboy under her roof. Grace settled into her father's old rocking chair for the night, a blanket pulled around her shoulders, and the shotgun resting nearby, just in case the man's story wasn't as straightforward as a simple shooting. She'd learned long ago that in the West, trust had to be earned, and even the most charming strangers could harbor dangerous secrets. As she drifted off to an uneasy sleep, her last thoughts were of those striking blue eyes and the gentle way he'd called her love. Morning arrived with golden light streaming through the cabin windows. Grace awoke with a stiff neck, momentarily confused by her position in the chair, until the events of the previous night flooded back. Her eyes immediately went to the bed where Garrett lay, surprised to find him awake and watching her. "Good morning," he said, his voice stronger than it had been the night before. "I hope you didn't spend the entire night in that chair because of me." Grace straightened, pushing a loose strand of honey-brown hair behind her ear. "Someone had to make sure you didn't die in my bed," she replied practically. "How's the pain?" "Bearable," Garrett answered, attempting to sit up before wincing and thinking better of it. "I've had worse." "I doubt that," Grace countered, rising to check his bandages. The wound wasn't showing signs of infection yet, which was a good sign. "Mind telling me how you ended up shot and on my doorstep?" Garrett's expression darkened slightly. "I was ambushed about 10 miles south of here. 3 men, I think they were after my horse and whatever they thought I might be carrying." "Were they?" Grace asked, carefully peeling back the edge of his bandage. "What? After your horse? Or was there another reason someone might want to put a bullet in you, Mr. Keller?" Garrett met her gaze steadily. "I'm not an outlaw, if that's what you're asking. I work for the Transcontinental Stage Company as a special messenger. Was carrying payroll documents to the mining operation north of here." Grace raised an eyebrow. "Important job." "Usually boring," he replied with a hint of a smile. "Until last night. My horse must have remembered passing your place on a previous journey. Smart animal brought me right to you when I could barely stay in the saddle." "Lucky for you," Grace said, replacing the bandage. "You'll need to rest for at least a week before thinking about traveling again." Alarm crossed Garrett's face. "A week? I can't stay that long. Those documents need to get to the mine." "You won't make it a mile with that wound," Grace stated firmly. "Besides, if those men are still looking for you, you're safer here for now." Garrett looked like he wanted to argue but instead sank back against the pillows, conceding the point. "I don't want to be a burden." "Too late for that," Grace said dryly, but there was no real bite to her words. "I'll make us some breakfast." You need to keep up your strength if you want that wound to heal properly." As she moved about the small kitchen area, Grace was acutely aware of Garrett's eyes following her. It had been a long time since she'd shared her space with anyone, let alone a man, and his presence filled the cabin in a way that was both unsettling and oddly comforting. "You live out here alone?" Garrett asked as she brought him a plate of eggs and salt pork. "Since my father died," Grace answered, helping him sit up enough to eat. 2 years now." "That's not common," he observed. "Most women would have moved to town or found themselves a husband." Grace stiffened slightly. "I'm not most women, Mr. Keller. This land was my father's dream and now it's mine. I manage just fine." Garrett looked around the well-kept cabin, noting the subtle touches that made it a home: dried wildflowers in a jar on the table, carefully mended curtains at the windows, a bookshelf stocked with more volumes than most frontier homes would boast. "I can see that," he said softly. "And please call me Garrett. I think we're past formalities after you dug a bullet out of me." That drew a small smile from Grace. "Fair enough, Garrett." The next few days fell into an unexpected rhythm. Though initially resistant to being confined to bed, Garrett proved to be a surprisingly good patient, following Grace's instructions and resting as much as his restless nature would allow. When fever briefly took hold on the second night, Grace stayed by his side, cooling his brow with damp cloths and forcing herbal remedies between his parched lips until the worst passed. By the fourth day, Garrett was strong enough to sit at her small table for meals, and Grace found herself enjoying the company more than she cared to admit. He told stories of his travels across the Western Territories, describing landscapes she'd only read about in books and recounting adventures that made her small ranch seem even more isolated than it was. "Have you always worked for the stage company?" Grace asked one evening as she mended one of her shirts by lamplight. Garrett, who was whittling a small piece of wood nearby, shook his head. "I was a cavalry scout during the war, then tried my hand at ranching in Texas afterward. Wasn't suited for it, too restless to stay in one place. The messenger job lets me move around while still earning a decent wage. No family waiting for you somewhere." The question slipped out before Grace could consider its propriety. Garrett's hand stilled for a moment. "No, lost my parents young. Had a brother, but he died at Gettysburg." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "What about you? No suitors trying to claim this fine property and its capable mistress." Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks, but kept her voice steady. "Calistoga has its share of men who fancy themselves potential husbands, but none who see me as anything but a means to acquire land." She set her mending down. "My father always said I should marry for love or not at all. So far, the latter seems more likely." "Your father sounds like a wise man." "He was," Grace agreed, a hint of sadness in her voice. "Swedish immigrant who came west with nothing but dreams. Built this place board by board, taught me everything from hunting to horseshoeing." "He did a fine job," Garrett said softly. "You're quite remarkable, Grace Evans." Something in his tone made Grace look up sharply, but his expression was unreadable in the lamplight, his attention seemingly returned to his whittling. An unfamiliar flutter stirred in her chest, and she quickly stood to busy herself with unnecessary tasks around the cabin. By the end of the week, Garrett was moving more freely, though Grace insisted on changing his bandages herself to ensure the wound was healing properly. Each time her fingers brushed against his skin, that same flutter returned, increasingly difficult to ignore. "I think I should try riding tomorrow," Garrett announced on the 8th day as they finished a simple supper of rabbit stew. Those documents should have been delivered days ago. Though she knew it was coming, the statement sent an unexpected pang through Grace. Your wound could still reopen if you push too hard, she countered. I've imposed on your hospitality long enough, Garrett said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced himself. At least wait until the stitches are ready to come out, Grace suggested. Another day or two. The company will understand once they know you were shot. Garrett studied her face for a long moment. Are you concerned for my health, or is there another reason you'd like me to stay, Grace? The directness of his question caught her off guard. Grace was used to handling herself in all situations, but this man had a way of seeing through her carefully constructed defenses. I'm concerned about finding you collapsed on my property again if you ride out too soon, she replied evenly, rising to clear their plates. Garrett caught her wrist gently as she reached for his bowl. Grace, he said softly, look at me. Reluctantly, she met his gaze, finding an intensity there that made her breath catch. These past days have been unexpected, he continued. I came here half dead, a stranger. But I don't feel like a stranger anymore. You're not, Grace admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Garrett's thumb traced a small circle on the inside of her wrist. I don't want to leave yet, he confessed, and I don't think you want me to either. The honesty of his words broke through the last of her reserve. No, Grace acknowledged, I don't. The moment hung between them, filled with possibility. Then Garrett slowly released her wrist. Then I'll stay a few more days, until the stitches come out. Relief washed through Grace, along with something else, anticipation, perhaps. She nodded and continued clearing the table, aware that something fundamental had shifted between them. The next morning brought unexpected company. Grace was in the garden harvesting late vegetables when the sound of approaching horses made her straighten, hand instinctively moving to the knife at her belt. 3 riders came into view, and she recognized the lead man as Sheriff Jim Parker from Calistoga. Miss Evans, the sheriff called, tipping his hat as they drew closer. Hope we're not intruding. Not at all, Sheriff, Grace replied cautiously. What brings you out this way? Looking for a messenger who went missing last week, Parker explained, dismounting. Stage companies concerned. Man named Keller, carrying important papers. Before Grace could respond, the cabin door opened and Garrett appeared, moving stiffly but standing straight. Sheriff Parker, he called. Your timing is excellent. I was just about to send word to town. The sheriff's eyebrows shot up. Keller. What in tarnation happened to you? Over coffee at Grace's table, Garrett explained about the ambush and his injury. The sheriff listened intently, occasionally making notes in a small book. Sounds like the Harrow gang, he concluded. They've been hitting messengers and stage coaches between here and Sacramento. Did they get the documents? Garrett shook his head, a small smile playing at his lips. No. When I realized I was being followed, I hid them. He glanced at Grace. They're in a waterproof pouch inside my saddle padding. Would have told you sooner, but I wasn't sure I could trust anyone until I knew who was after me. Sensible precaution, the sheriff agreed. I'll have one of my deputies escort you to the mine once you're fit to ride. I appreciate that, Garrett said. Miss Evans has been kind enough to nurse me back to health, but I should be ready to complete my delivery in a day or two. The formality with which Garrett referred to her stung Grace slightly, though she understood its necessity in front of the sheriff and his men. She excused herself to prepare more coffee, needing a moment to compose herself. In the kitchen area, she was surprised when one of the deputies followed her, a young man named Jacob whom she recognized from town. Miss Evans, he said quietly, I should warn you that there's been talk in town. Grace stiffened. What kind of talk? About you having a man staying here, Jacob replied uncomfortably. Mrs. Whittaker saw Mr. Keller's horse in your stable when she was passing by last week. Word spreads fast. Of course it did. Grace had known the risk to her reputation when she'd taken Garrett in, but saving his life had seemed more important than town gossip. "Thank you for telling me," she said evenly. "Though I hardly see how a wounded man recovering under my roof is anyone's concern but mine." Jacob shrugged apologetically. "You know how people can be. Just thought you should know." When the sheriff and his men departed, promising to return in 2 days to escort Garrett to the mine, an uncomfortable silence fell over the cabin. Garrett stood by the window, watching the riders disappear down the road. "You didn't mention the town gossip," he finally said without turning. Grace busied herself washing the coffee cups. "It's nothing I haven't dealt with before." Garrett turned to face her. "It's different this time. This affects your reputation." "My reputation?" Grace gave a short laugh. "The woman who lives alone and does men's work. I doubt it could suffer much more." "Grace." The gentleness in his voice made her look up. "You saved my life at considerable risk to yourself. The least I can do is ensure you don't pay a social price for it." A cold weight settled in Grace's stomach. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Garrett crossed to her slowly. "I'm suggesting that I care about what happens to you, that these past days have meant something to me. That leaving you to face town gossip alone isn't something I'm willing to do." "I don't need rescuing, Garrett," Grace said firmly, though her heart was racing. "Not from gossip, not from loneliness, not from anything." "I know you don't need it," he said, stopping just before her. "That's what makes you remarkable. But wanting company and needing rescue aren't the same thing." He reached out, carefully tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. The simple gesture felt more intimate than anything Grace had experienced before. "I have to deliver these documents," Garrett continued. "It's my duty, but afterward, I'd like to come back if you'll have me." Grace studied his face, looking for any sign of pity or obligation. She found none, only an openness that matched the sincerity in his voice. "Why?" she asked simply. "Because in all my travels, I've never met anyone quite like you," Garrett answered, his hand coming to rest lightly on her shoulder. "Because when I think about leaving, it feels wrong. Because I think we both deserve to find out if there's something real between us." Grace hesitated, years of self-reliance making it difficult to accept what he was offering. "And if there isn't, then at least we'll know," Garrett said with a small smile. "But I think we both suspect there is." Before Grace could respond, Garrett leaned down slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. When she didn't, his lips met hers in a gentle kiss that nonetheless sent warmth spreading through her entire body. His hand came up to cup her cheek, and Grace found herself leaning into his touch, her own hands rising to rest against his chest. When they finally broke apart, Grace was breathless, her carefully constructed world tilted on its axis. "You should be careful of your stitches," she managed, making Garrett laugh softly. "Some things are worth the risk," he murmured, his forehead resting against hers. The next 2 days passed in a strange mixture of anticipation and dread. While their relationship had undeniably changed, with casual touches and shared glances now commonplace, Grace couldn't shake the fear that Garrett's promises to return were simply the romantic notions of a man still grateful to his rescuer. On the morning the sheriff was due to arrive, Grace removed Garrett's stitches, her fingers steady despite the emotions churning inside her. The wound had healed well, leaving what would eventually be a pale scar across his ribs. "You do good work, Doc Evans," Garrett teased as he pulled his shirt back on a spare of her father's that she'd altered to fit his broader shoulders. "Just don't make a habit of needing my services," Grace replied, packing away her medical supplies. Garrett caught her hand. "I meant what I said, Grace. I'm coming back." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Outside, horses approached, signaling the arrival of the sheriff. The moment for goodbyes had come too quickly. Garrett gathered his few belongings while Grace saddled his horse. The chestnut stallion seemed eager to travel after days of leisure in her small pasture. When everything was ready, Garrett stood beside his mount, looking reluctant to leave despite his reassurances. "It shouldn't take more than a week," he said. "The mine is 3 days' ride north, and I'll need to stay for the paperwork to be processed." "I'll be here," Grace said simply. What more could she say? That in just over a week, this man had somehow become essential to her, that she was already calculating the hours until his promised return. Garrett stepped close, one hand coming up to trace the line of her jaw. "I never expected to find something precious when I was bleeding out on your doorstep," he said quietly. "And I never expected to welcome a half-dead messenger into my life," Grace replied, attempting to lighten the moment despite the tightness in her throat. Garrett smiled, then kissed her a deeper, more urgent kiss than their first, as if trying to leave part of himself with her. When they separated, the sheriff was pointedly looking elsewhere, while his deputy seemed fascinated by a distant hawk circling overhead. "1 week," Garrett promised, mounting his horse with only a slight wince. "Wait for me." As Grace watched the 3 riders disappear down the trail, she felt oddly bereft, her cabin suddenly too quiet, too empty. She'd been alone for years without feeling lonely until now. The days crawled by, each one longer than the last. Grace threw herself into work around the ranch, repairing fences that didn't need fixing and reorganizing supplies that were already in order. At night, she found herself staring at the bed where Garrett had lain, remembering the sound of his voice in the darkness and the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. On the 4th day, a wagon arrived from town carrying Julia Bennett, the shopkeeper's wife and one of the few women in Calistoga who had always treated Grace with kindness. "Thought you might want some company," Julia said cheerfully, producing a basket of fresh bread and preserves. "And maybe some news from town." Over tea, Julia confirmed what the deputy had warned. Grace's reputation was the subject of considerable speculation. "Most folks understand you were doing a Christian duty," Julia assured her, "but you know how some people love to talk." "Especially that busybody Ethel Whitaker," Grace sighed. "Let them talk, I've never much cared for their opinions anyway." Julia studied her thoughtfully. "This messenger, he's coming back, isn't he?" Grace hesitated, then nodded. "I thought as much," Julia said with a knowing smile. "I saw the way he looked at you when they rode through town, like a man who'd found something he didn't know he was looking for." The observation warmed Grace unexpectedly. "He said he'd return within a week." "And you care for him?" Julia asked gently. "I hardly know him," Grace protested weakly. "Sometimes that doesn't matter," Julia replied. "My Henry proposed after knowing me just 10 days. When it's right, it's right." After Julia left, Grace found herself contemplating possibilities she'd never seriously considered before. A life not lived in solitude. Someone to share the burdens and joys of each day. The idea was both exhilarating and terrifying. The 7th day since Garrett's departure dawned crisp and clear. Grace woke early, unable to lie still any longer. She dressed with more care than usual, pinning her hair in a simpler style than her practical work braid. Ridiculous, she chided herself. He might not even come today. But as the morning progressed, she found herself glancing repeatedly down the trail, her heart leaping at every distant sound. By midday, disappointment was beginning to set in. By late afternoon, she was trying to convince herself that she'd been foolish to expect him so soon. A mining operation would have paperwork, delays. A week had been an optimistic estimate. As dusk approached, Grace forced herself to focus on practical tasks, feeding the animals and preparing a simple supper for one. The sound of an approaching rider barely registered at first. She'd been hearing phantom hoofbeats all day. But when her mare nickered a greeting from the paddock, Grace froze, then rushed to the door. A lone rider approached through the gathering twilight, his familiar silhouette causing her breath to catch. Garrett dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, wincing slightly as his boots hit the ground but otherwise moving with the ease of a healed man. Grace stood on the porch, suddenly unsure of herself. What if the connection they'd felt was nothing more than the intensity of the situation? What if, having fulfilled his promise to return, he would now bid her farewell and continue on his way? But then Garrett was before her, his eyes drinking her in as if memorizing every detail of her face. "Grace," he said, her name sounding like a prayer on his lips. "You came back," she whispered, hating how vulnerable the words made her sound. "I promised I would," Garrett replied, reaching for her hands. "Though I nearly rode my horse into the ground getting here today, couldn't stand the thought of being away one more night." Something tight in Grace's chest loosened at his words. "You're just in time for supper," she said, trying to sound casual despite the joy threatening to overflow. "Though I only made enough for one." Garrett smiled, that crooked, warm smile that had begun to feel like home. "I'm not particularly hungry," he said, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "Not for food, anyway." Heat rose to Grace's cheeks, but she didn't look away. "Mr. Keller, that's rather forward of you." "Miss Evans," he countered, drawing her closer, "I believe we're past formalities." Their kiss was different this time, unhurried yet urgent, filled with promise rather than goodbye. When they finally broke apart, Garrett rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm on her face. "I have something to tell you," he said. "I resigned from the messenger service." Grace pulled back slightly, surprised. "You did? Why?" "Because I've spent 7 years carrying other people's valuables across territories," Garrett explained, "when what I really want is to build something of my own, with someone who matters to me." The implication of his words hung in the air between them. Grace searched his face, hardly daring to hope. "That's a big decision to make in such a short time." "I've never been more certain of anything," Garrett said firmly. "I know this is fast, Grace. I know we're still learning each other. But I also know that what I feel for you is real and rare. I'd like the chance to see where it leads. If you'll have me." Grace took a deep breath, years of independence making her hesitate despite the certainty in her heart. "What exactly are you proposing, Garrett Keller?" "Initially, that I stay, help with the ranch, court you properly, scandal be damned." His eyes held hers steadily. "And eventually, if you'll have me, something more permanent." The frankness of his proposition, so unlike the calculated interest of previous suitors who had only seen her land and not her, touched Grace deeply. Here was a man offering partnership, not ownership. "The town will talk," she warned, though she was already leaning toward acceptance. Garrett shrugged. "Let them. They'll have even more to talk about when I build that addition on your cabin that you need for a proper kitchen." Grace couldn't help but laugh. "You're very sure of your welcome, Mr. Keller." "Not at all," he replied, his expression growing serious. "I'm hoping, Grace, nothing more, nothing less." In that moment, Grace made her decision, or perhaps acknowledged the decision her heart had already made. "Then stay," she said simply. "Help with the ranch, court me properly, and we'll see where it leads." The relief and joy that spread across Garrett's face was answer enough. He pulled her close again, sealing their agreement with a kiss that felt like a beginning. The following weeks brought changes both subtle and profound to Grace's life. Garrett moved into her father's old cabin, a small structure 100 yards from the main house that had served as a workshop in recent years. The arrangement preserved Grace's reputation, at least nominally, while allowing them to build their relationship away from prying eyes. Grace discovered that Garrett was as good with his hands as he was with horses, repairing long, neglected fences and building the kitchen extension he'd promised. More than that, he brought laughter back into her life, filling evenings with stories of his travels and genuinely interested in hearing about her own experiences. October gave way to November, bringing cooler weather and the first hints of the coming winter. On a crisp morning, Garrett suggested they ride to the far edge of Grace's property, a ridge overlooking the valley that she rarely visited due to the demands of daily ranch work. "There's something I want to show you," he said mysteriously as they saddled their horses. The ride was invigorating, fallen leaves crunching beneath the horses' hooves as they wound their way up the slope. When they reached the ridge, Grace gasped at the view Calistoga Valley spread before them, a patchwork of farms, vineyards, and wild country painted in autumn colors. "It's beautiful," she breathed, dismounting to better appreciate the panorama. "Your father chose well," Garrett agreed, joining her at the edge. "This land has good bones." Grace glanced at him curiously. "You've been studying it." Garrett nodded, suddenly looking uncharacteristically nervous. "I have. I've been thinking about the future, our future specifically." He took her hands in his, turning to face her fully. "Grace Evans, these past weeks have been the happiest of my life. I know it hasn't been long, but some things you just know deep down." Grace's heart began to race as she realized what was coming. "I love you," Garrett continued, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "I love your strength, your kindness, your stubborn independence. I love that you saved my life and then proceeded to challenge me every day since. I want to build a life with you, right here on this land your father loved." From his pocket, he produced a simple gold band. "This was my mother's," he explained. "I've carried it for years, waiting for the right person. I never thought I'd find her when I was bleeding half to death on a lonely trail." Grace laughed softly, tears welling in her eyes despite her best efforts to contain them. "Grace Evans, will you marry me?" Garrett asked, his voice catching slightly. "Will you be my wife, my partner, the mother of my children? Will you let me love you for the rest of our days?" For a woman who prided herself on her practical nature, Grace was surprised by how easily the answer came. "Yes," she said, her voice strong despite her tears. "Yes, Garrett Keller. I will." The ring slid onto her finger, a perfect fit that seemed like another sign that this unlikely match was meant to be. When Garrett pulled her into his arms, Grace felt a sense of rightness, of coming home, that she had never expected to find. Their wedding took place 2 weeks later in the small church in Calistoga. To Grace's surprise, nearly the entire town turned out for the ceremony. Julia Bennett had taken it upon herself to ensure Grace had a proper wedding dress, altering her own from years earlier to fit Grace's more slender frame. "Every bride deserves to feel beautiful," Julia insisted when Grace protested the extravagance. Sheriff Parker stood as Garrett's best man, while Julia served as Grace's matron of honor. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, Grace and Garrett exchanging vows they had written themselves. "I promise to be your partner in all things," Grace said, her voice clear in the hushed church. "To respect your strength as you respect mine. To build our life together on a foundation of trust and honesty. To love you through all seasons, Garrett Keller, for as long as we both shall live." Garrett's vows were equally moving, bringing tears to the eyes of even the most stoic ranchers in attendance. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, their kiss drew spontaneous applause from the congregation. The celebration afterward was lively, with townsfolk who had once gossiped about Grace now toasting her happiness. As the evening progressed, Grace found herself beside Ethel Whitaker, the very woman whose gossip had initially caused concern. "I was wrong about you, Grace Keller," Ethel said with surprising candor. "You've got more sense than most of us gave you credit for. He's a good man." "The best," Grace agreed, watching as Garrett laughed with a group of miners across the room. "And the way he looks at you," Ethel continued, a touch of wistfulness in her voice. "Like you hung the moon and stars. That's rare, child. Hold on to it." "I intend to," Grace replied softly. Later that night, when they returned to the ranch, their ranch now, Garrett carried Grace across the threshold of the cabin as tradition demanded, though she protested that she was perfectly capable of walking. "Humor me," he said, setting her gently on her feet in the main room, now transformed by their shared possessions and the improvements Garrett had made. "Mrs. Keller." The name sent a pleasant shiver through Grace. "It still sounds strange," she admitted. "We have a lifetime for it to become familiar," Garrett said, drawing her close. That night, as they lay together in the quiet darkness, Grace marveled at how completely her life had changed in such a short time. From solitary independence to passionate partnership, from resigned loneliness to profound connection, all because a wounded cowboy had needed care on a lonely night. "What are you thinking?" Garrett murmured, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "That I'm grateful your horse knew where to bring you," Grace replied, nestling closer against his side. Garrett chuckled softly. "So am I, love. So am I." The winter of 1873 passed in domestic contentment, the ranch thriving under their combined efforts. Spring brought new beginnings in more ways than one, as Grace discovered she was expecting their first child. "Are you happy?" she asked Garrett when she shared the news, her hand instinctively resting on her still flat stomach. His response was to sweep her into a careful embrace, his joy evident in every line of his face. "Ecstatic," he whispered against her hair. "Terrified, grateful, all at once." "That makes two of us," Grace admitted with a laugh. Their son, William James Keller, was born on a clear December morning in 1874, exactly 1 year and 1 week after Garrett had first appeared on Grace's doorstep. With his father's blue eyes and his mother's determined chin, he was the perfect embodiment of their union. As Grace held their son while Garrett sat beside her on the bed, his arm around her shoulders, she thought about the strange paths that life could take. How a gunshot on a lonely night had led to the greatest happiness she had ever known. "Thank you," Garrett said softly, pressing a kiss to her temple. "For what?" Grace asked, looking up from their newborn's face. "For saving my life that night," he replied. "For taking a chance on a half-dead stranger. For giving me a home, a purpose, a family." Grace smiled, leaning into his embrace. "It seems we saved each other," she said simply. Outside, snow began to fall, blanketing their land in pristine white. Inside, the Keller family remained wrapped in the warmth of their love, a love born from an unexpected encounter and nurtured through courage, trust, and the willingness to open their hearts to possibility. In the years that followed, the Keller ranch prospered and grew. Garrett's experience traveling through cattle country proved invaluable as they expanded their herds, while Grace's careful management ensured the operation remained profitable even in lean years. Their family grew as well, with a daughter, Elizabeth Grace, joining them 2 years after William, and another son, Thomas Henry, 3 years after that. By 1880, the small homestead had transformed into one of the most respected ranches in the Calistoga area. The cabin had been expanded into a proper house, with rooms for the children and the modern conveniences that were slowly making their way west. Yet through all the changes, Grace and Garrett maintained the essential partnership that had begun that fateful night, equal in all things, supporting each other's strengths and shoring up each other's weaknesses. On the 10th anniversary of their meeting, Garrett surprised Grace by taking her back to the ridge where he had proposed, a picnic basket packed with her favorite foods and a bottle of wine from one of the new Napa vineyards. "Can you believe it's been 10 years?" Grace asked as they sat on a blanket overlooking their land, now a thriving cattle operation with carefully managed pastures stretching across the valley. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday," Garrett replied, pouring her a glass of wine. "Other times, I can hardly remember my life before you." "Before 3 children and 200 head of cattle, you mean?" Grace laughed. Accepting the glass, Garrett smiled, the lines at the corners of his eyes more pronounced now, but his gaze still as warm and steady as the day they'd met. "Before you gave my restless heart a place to call home." He reached into his pocket and produced a small box. "I have something for you." Grace opened it to find a gold locket, beautifully engraved with intertwined initials. Inside were miniature portraits of their 3 children, expertly painted by a traveling artist who had visited Calistoga the previous month. "Garrett," she breathed, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "It's beautiful." "Not half as beautiful as the life you've given me," he replied, helping her fasten the locket around her neck. As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the valley that was their home, Grace reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. From a wounded stranger and a solitary woman to partners in every sense, building a life neither could have imagined on their own. "What are you thinking?" Garrett asked, just as he had on their wedding night all those years ago. Grace turned to him, this man who had ridden into her life bleeding and half-conscious, and somehow become the center of her world. "I'm thinking that I'm the luckiest woman in California," she said honestly, "and that I wouldn't change a single moment of our story." "Not even the part where I got shot," Garrett teased, pulling her close against him. Grace laughed, settling into the embrace that still felt like coming home after all these years. "Especially not that part. After all, that bullet brought you to me." "No," Garrett corrected softly, his lips brushing her temple. "It was more than the bullet, more than chance. It was fate, Grace. We were always meant to find each other." As they gathered their things and mounted their horses to return to the ranch where their children waited, Grace couldn't help but agree. Some things were simply meant to be, like an injured cowboy finding care on a lonely night, and a solitary woman finding love when she least expected it. And as they rode home side by side, just as they had traveled through life for the past decade, Grace knew with absolute certainty that their story was far from over. There would be more challenges, more joys, more memories to create together. But whatever came their way, they would face it as they always had together, partners in all things, bound by a love that had begun with a whispered "thank you." Love, and grown into something stronger and more enduring than either could have imagined on that fateful night so long ago.